Now I call upon Mrs. Mara Caroline from USA to talk on lessons learned from a global perspective. She is presently a lecturer at the Department of Strategic Studies at the Johns Hopkins University and also the adjunct faculty member of the same university. She has many experiences. She had worked in the RAND Corporation. She was an advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and also advised to Secretary of Defense for Policy on wide range of foreign policy issues. I welcome you to the
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. Thank you all very much. I'd especially like to thank the Vice Chancellor, who I met when he was quite ably serving your country as its defense attaché to Washington. Today, I would like to discuss issues to consider and potential lessons learned from other post-conflict militaries for Sri Lanka's military in light of the LTTE's defeat 2 years ago. Given the watershed nature of the military's success in 2009, following nearly 3 decades of war, it is now appropriate and worthwhile to examine its impact on the military's future. As Sri Lanka becomes increasingly stable, the military's mission, role, and requirements will surely continue to evolve. Issues such as the appropriate role the military should adopt throughout the country, its size now that the mission has evolved, how to conduct a deft process of reduction and integration, and how to sufficiently account for Sri Lanka's future needs should be examined. In this vein, other post-conflict situations provide useful case studies to examine. As is necessarily the case with effective security sector reform, a broader process of examination and reform would likely translate into more transparent and representative Sri Lankan institutions. I should note, while I am examining broader issues today, it is beyond my scope to delve into the very challenges inherent in sufficiently countering violent insurgents like the LTTE who do not follow international norms. It is not possible to ignore very real and serious concerns about how the war's conclusion was effected. Indeed, beyond the international community's legitimate concerns, there's actually another relevant lens through which to view the war's conclusion, specifically the implications it has for security sector reform in the post-war environment. A transparent, serious discussion of these affairs is necessary, not least because it informs the post-conflict environment. This is a critical moment for Sri Lanka's future. Studies of armed conflict demonstrate the very real dynamic of conflict trap, in which states that experience civil wars are more likely to face further violence in the future. Indeed, conflict is 5 times more likely in post-conflict countries than in similar countries that have not had a war for 10 years. Further, countries that fail to conduct a sufficiently representative and frank dialogue on their post-conflict environment often face resurgence in violence. The Sri Lankan government's dialogue to date, therefore, is extremely important for the efficacy of security sector reform. Issues like accountability and reconciliation, which may seem beyond the scope of security sector reform, invariably impact it. A failure to sufficiently conduct such a dialogue has hindered Lebanon since its civil war ended more than 2 decades ago, whereas a robust effort enabled South Africa and Rwanda to make much progress in moving beyond their civil conflicts. Efforts by the Sri Lankan military to bring together some of those Sri Lankans most personally affected by the war are a start. It is therefore both timely and necessary to consider how the Sri Lankan people can best undergo a transparent process of accountability and reconciliation. An energetic process of security sector reform could minimize a return to violence in Sri Lanka. Given that frameworks exist in terms of how militaries might reform and evolve post-conflict, it's worth examining militaries that have faced these problems elsewhere in other post-conflict contexts to see if there might not be some lessons learned for Sri Lanka. A more representative, efficient, and accountable security sector can have positive, far-reaching implications for Sri Lanka as it has for other post-conflict environments. Mission and roles. For robust security sector reform, it is first necessary to broadly consider what the Sri Lankan military's mission and role should be. After nearly 3 decades with an unwavering focus on countering the LTTE, the military is now in a position where it needs to determine what appropriate future role it should play. What should be the contours and parameters of its national security policy? An active dialogue between and among Sri Lanka's political and military leaders about the military's mission post-conflict is critical, since its mission is invariably evolving. Similarly, civil-military relations may benefit from a greater delineation of roles and responsibilities. Evidence has demonstrated that a robust dialogue on these issues helped facilitate a more peaceful post-conflict environment in Colombia. A lack of such dialogue may have played a role in the return to violence in Timor-Leste. Specialization and prioritization is necessary, though it can have some inadvertent and attendant complications. Israel, for example, had focused on counterterrorism in response to the Second Palestinian Intifada that erupted in fall 2000. Doing so atrophied its conventional abilities that were then necessary for countering Hezbollah in a hybrid conflict during the summer of 2006. In the north and east, for example, the Sri Lankan military is intimately involved with maintaining order. Over the last 2 years, it has helped resettle hundreds of thousands of IDPs, minimize security zones, and demine millions of square meters of land. With much of this work complete, it is worthwhile to consider how the mission should evolve in this regard. To what extent should this be a permanent part of the mission? If not, when should it begin diminishing, and how? In Egypt, for example, there have been unhelpful repercussions and distortions due to the military's deep penetration of the development and business sector. One should be cautious about too deep of a relationship between development and the military. What are the Sri Lankan armed forces' comparative advantages, regionally and globally? A thoughtful process to ascertain this will enable the military to more deeply specialize and contribute to the international warfighting community. At a minimum, its disaster response skills and its maritime counterterrorism capabilities and experience in littoral combat are particularly worthwhile. For example, it makes sense for the Navy to actively share its expertise in this arena, which could be particularly useful for countries countering maritime challenges in places like the Horn of Africa and the Strait of Hormuz. Planning. Because for much of the last 3 decades or so, the military focused on either active conflict with the LTTE or its inevitable resurgence, planning appropriately for the military's needs was understandably difficult. In American national security circles today, a robust dialogue is taking place on this issue. With the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan winding down, to say nothing of the extremely constrained fiscal environment that the United States faces, it will be necessary to strike a balance in the U.S. between recalibrating defense forces and ensuring they are adequately prepared to counter potential threats. In many ways, the United States is in the throes of an active security sector reform effort, working to right-size the U.S. military and to appropriately posture it in a dynamic threat environment. Services. Security sector reform requires a penetrating examination of the military's components. Some preliminary thoughts to consider. The Army. What should the Army structure be now that the LTTE is defeated? Which capabilities must it retain? Which can receive less attention? And what training and equipment is appropriate for doing so? As some security analysts have quipped, the postmodern soldier is not only a fighter, but also a peacekeeper, policeman, diplomat, social worker, and Peace Corps worker. Which of these roles is most appropriate for the Sri Lankan Army, and why? The Navy and Air Force. Given Sri Lanka's strategic location in the Indian Ocean,